how much proof do you need to prove a miracle is true? On this channel, I frequently share stories of people who report having experienced a miracle or witnessed a miracle. And I know some people like to look at that in a skeptical way, and I don't blame them. But just like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, sometimes miracles are in the eye of the beholder as well. But every now and then, a miracle comes along with compelling evidence. Today's story is one of those, where you're invited into the reality of a 15-year-old girl who seemed poised to step into a bright and promising future, but instead found herself in a body that was betraying her. She was described by one of her doctors as the most hopelessly ill patient he'd ever seen. And then what happened after a divine encounter that changed everything? If that's something you'd like to think about, then welcome to Check Your Head Stories, where we explore the bright side of things that can be quite disturbing with tales of the miraculous, the curious, and the oddly beautiful. And if you want to help spread the cheer without losing your edge, be sure to press the like button and subscribe. Let's get to it. Check your head. What do you like to think about? In 1965, Barbra Cummisky, a high school sophomore in Wheaton, Illinois, stood ready to take the rings to do her gymnastics routine. Now, usually, Barbra was energized and emboldened by the sound of the crowd and the cheers, but not this time. Her breathing was shallow and her heart was racing. She kept trying to calm herself down, saying, I've got this, because recently all of her gymnastics performance in all the events had been slipping. As she stepped onto the padded mat, she said, whatever I've got in my head, I've got to get it out. Her coaches kept telling her, it's mind over matter, just focus, and she did her best to focus. She took a deep breath, she jumped up and grabbed the rings. The grip was good. She said, I've got this. She started to pull herself up. She engaged her core and began to bend her elbows so she'd take the upright position. But as she was pulling up, all of a sudden her grip just let go and she had no control over it. And she fell with an awkward thud. The crowd gasped, and despite the full padding of the mat, she was injured. Barbra has no recall of being helped off the mat or even being carried to the sidelines. Not because of the pain or even the public humiliation. She knew something was very wrong. And it wasn't an issue of mind over matter like her coaches says. Her body was not doing what she told it to do. Over the next few weeks and months, she did her best to push aside a gnawing fear that was growing because she was losing control over her movements. Frequently, she would stub her toe or trip, and she started running into walls. Her sister tried to lighten things up and called her clumsy Cummisky. But pretty clearly, this wasn't just a passing growth phase, and it was getting worse. Her classmates started to notice, and she would run into things all the time, and then the rumors started. They said, I think she's a drunk. That was the rumor that went around, and this once popular athlete, musician, and student leader in her youth group began to be shunned. Her dexterity was giving her problems playing the flute, and so she had to drop out of orchestra. Her handwriting, which she'd always taken pride in, began to be illegible. It looked like a little child's writing. Her grades began to slip. She was having trouble organizing her thoughts. She began to feel socially awkward. All of this made her pull inside, and she became socially isolated, and the doctors couldn't figure it out. All of a sudden, life became challenging in every way. She struggled to finish high school, where once she'd been a great student, now she could barely pull passing grades. She did graduate in 1968, and she planned to go on to college, but those plans were waylaid because she developed double vision, and now she was struggling to read. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with Barbra. She kept going for tests, and they tried different things, but nothing seemed to help. Now, this was before CT scans and MRIs, and before our imaging was so good. So when she finally went in 1970, they did a spinal tap, and the diagnosis was the worst one. It didn't seem possible because she was too young. But Barbra was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. MS is a degenerative disease. And while many patients can go decades without even presenting with any symptoms, and almost half of MS patients never have anything that's severe, that was not the case for Barbra. Her prognosis was not good. She'd always been a strong Christian. She loved Jesus, but for the first time in her life, she lost faith. She asked the very human question, how could a God of love allow this? What had she done to deserve this? Her family and her church community gave great support, and her pastors, they offered loving and patient counseling. But Barbra's struggle was real. She had to choose how she was going to respond to this disappointment, this heartbreak, to this devastation. She had to face this in a way that was going to get her through. After some time, Barbra chose to keep believing and trusting. Now, anyone who's been through a long-term illness, especially a degenerative one, or been with someone who has, you know that kind of decision is not a one and done. It's one day at a time. No, you know what? No, it's one moment at a time. But Barbra decided that she was going to make her decisions and make this battle something she was going to give to God. It was going to be a spiritual battle as well as a physical one. Barbra's life became a series of health crises and hospital stays. And each time she would have a health crisis, it'd be followed by a lull in symptoms, but each one would take her lower. She had increasing problems with mobility and walking. But then the greatest humiliation came when she lost control over her bowels and urination. She had to have a permanent catheter and had to have an ileostomy in her abdomen, and she had to have her waste collected in bags. In 1974, she completely lost the ability to walk and was confined to a wheelchair. And then she went legally blind. She had to be put on oxygen constantly. In 1978, she had to be hospitalized 7 times for breathing problems, and each time was near fatal. That was the year she was referred to Dr. Harold Adolph at the Mayo Clinic in a desperate attempt to find a specialist who would at least help relieve some of her symptoms. By this time, her lungs were in terrible shape. One was completely collapsed. The other one had less than 50% capacity. Dr. Adolph put her on a trach and a feeding tube. Even this gifted doctor didn't have a bag of tricks to help Barbra. It was he who called her the most hopelessly ill patient he'd ever seen. During the next couple of years, Barbra's condition grew worse. Her hands became unusable and they curled in on themselves so that her fingertips actually touched her wrist. Her palms filled up with dead skin, and in order to clean them out, they had to actually pry the hand open. Her stomach became distended grotesquely because of the feeding tube. Her feet that went into a perpetual point, something called drop foot. She couldn't bend her foot at the ankle any longer, and then her body began to pull up into a perpetual fetal position. She could barely be in the wheelchair anymore, so she spent all of her time in bed. In order for her to communicate, for her to make a sound, someone had to come and cover the hole that was in her trach. Barbra would look to the light that was coming from her window. She could at least see that. But she knew out that window was a world that she was never going to be part of ever again. She wasn't going to have a normal life because she was trapped in this body that was twisted up like a pretzel. Still, she held on to her faith and her inner life flourished. It was during this time in 1981 that Dr. Thomas Marshall, her latest attending physician, after consulting with Dr. Adolph, made an appointment. He came and met with Barbra and her family, and he sat down and he said, "We've got to face it. It's time. There should be no more heroic efforts, no more hospitalizations, no more CPR. I recommend that we begin end-of-life care in home hospice. Barbra and her family had to agree. At the end of this solemn meeting, there were tears and prayers. But still, even during this time, Barbra's love for Jesus grew more and more. Barbra hadn't been able to attend church for 4 years, but her church family at Wheaton Wesleyan, very supportive. They were always coming by. They're reading to Barbra or praying with her, and the pastor came by every day. So the family was getting a lot of support, so was Barbra. One of the members that spring called into the big Christian radio station that was there in Chicago, WMBI. He called their prayer line and he asked people to pray urgently. He said, Barbra's in home hospice, please pray for her. Now, it was a long shot, but people really responded. In fact, over 450 letters came in, and these were all beautiful and encouraging, but again, this was an impossible situation. Now, it was June 7th, 1981, Pentecost Sunday. Two of Barbra's girlfriends and her aunt came by after church, and they wanted to encourage her because they brought along all those 450 letters and cards, and they were going to sit by Barbra's bedside and read them to us. So they sat down and they started reading the cards. Barbra was really overjoyed by what was happening. And as they finished one of the cards, they were about to open another one. There was a bit of a lull, and Barbra heard a voice booming from around her shoulder, coming into one of her ears, and the voice said, "My child, get up and walk." Barbra knew it was God, and she also knew that the other people in the room did not hear the voice. Barbra needed to tell them, so she became agitated. That's how she would communicate that she needed to talk. So one of her friends came over and put their finger on the hole so she could speak, and she began to tell them what she had just heard. Her friends just looked at each other. They didn't know what to make of it. Was she getting delusional at the end? But Barbra was so insistent. She said, "Go get my family." So they said, okay. So they left the room, and just as they did, Barbra jumped up out of bed. She wasn't able to do this. This was completely impossible, but there she stood. And then she looked at her hands, and they were open. She looked down on her feet. They were able to bend. She was able to stand flat on the floor. And then she realized, oh my gosh, I can see. She wasn't blind anymore. She just reached up and grabbed the trach and pulled it out of her throat so she could breathe. She could take a breath. At that point, all of her friends come back in with the aunt, and they just look there stunned, and they start jumping up and down and screaming, and Barbra's jumping up and down and screaming, and then her mother comes in, and first she's stunned. She just stands there, mouth open, and then she fell on her knees right in front of Barbra's feet, and it seemed like maybe she was going to worship, but that wasn't what she was doing. She began to feel her bottom of her legs, and she said, "Barbra, you have calves again." And she got up, and they were all jumping, and at that point, someone had come in the front door, Angela. Now, Angela was a physical therapist, and she heard what was going on, and she headed towards the room. And Barbra said, "Where's Dad? Where's Dad?" She said, Dad, where are you?" Now, of course, her father didn't think that Barbra could speak, so he thought it was Barbra's sister. He said, "Just a minute, I'm coming." But he wasn't coming. He was busy doing something else. Barbra called out to him again. He said, "Just a minute." But then Barbra said, "Wait a minute. I don't have to wait for him to come to me. I can run to him." So she ran out the room. All of the people that were in the room were following her, and they were laughing. And that's when Angela saw Barbra walking. She said, "Barbra, no, you can't do this. You've been in bed for 4 years. You haven't stood up for 7 years. Your heart, you've got to stop." And she ran, tried to take her pulse, but she wouldn't be stopped. Barbra just whished right by her. Angela knew what to do. She ran to the room and got the oxygen tank and followed behind, thinking that at any point Barbra was just going to collapse and maybe die right there. But Barbra went into the room where her father was. She stood and she began to dance around Her father was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, and he ran over to her and he grabbed her, and he's weeping and laughing and crying, and the two waltzed around the room. The joy was filling up the house. Barbra couldn't contain herself. She ran outside. It was 93 degrees out there and it was burning hot, but the pavement, the burning on her feet made her joyful because she could feel her feet again. She danced in the streets, and for so long they just continued to celebrate. Back inside the house, Barbra excitedly explained that she had a plan for that evening, and they let her lead. So she said, "We're going to go to church tonight because they have an evening service." They arrived a little bit late, and that was what Barbra wanted. The service had already started and they snuck in the back. Now, the leader was up in the front giving announcements. And at the end of announcement, they said, "Oh, have I forgotten anything? Anybody in the congregation have something they need to announce, or did I miss some detail?" That's when Barbra popped up, stepped into the middle aisle, and began to casually stroll right down to the front of the church. Now, of course, people in the congregation began to crane their necks. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Barbra Cummisky walking, no trach, and when she got to the front, she turned around and presented. Everyone was stunned. People broke out in spontaneous applause and they began to cheer. And then, as if it were planned, they all began to sing Amazing Grace together, a robust version to be sure, giving special emphasis to the line, "'Twas blind, but now I see." Everyone knew they had seen this night a miracle. The next day, Dr. Marshall thought he was seeing a ghost when Barbra Cummisky came walking into his exam room. He could not believe it, and the more he examined her, the less he could believe it. He was completely stunned. He ordered x-rays, and he sent her around to every doctor in the whole building. They all examined her. No one could even begin to take in what had happened. And when the x-ray came, he saw two perfectly healthy lungs. There was no scar tissue. They were completely working order. He checked. There was no muscle atrophy. He disconnected every tube that didn't have to be surgically removed. And then finally, after 3.5 hours, he sat her down. He said, "Okay, we're going to reconnect your bowel. Let's make that surgery date. But let me be the first to tell you, you are completely healed. Also, let me tell you, this is medically impossible. You're free to go live your life." This was a bona fide, documented miracle, and news began to spread. First, it was on WMBI. They reported it as answered prayer, and then other Christian outlets began to pick up the story. But it was so documented, and it was a medical miracle, so other outlets began to cover the story, including the Chicago Tribune. Her story was featured in multiple books, articles, television shows, academic research works, internet reports, and it was actually featured in 3 of the books written by her own doctors. It was also covered by Lee Strobel, the celebrity author, and by Craig S. Keener in his book Miracles Today. All of these I used as reference in my research for today's story. Now that Barbra was told that she was free to go and live her life she did. She went on to marry Bradley Snyder, a pastor, and she served with him for many years as they raised their 3 children in Virginia. Barbra went on to share her story worldwide, and every time she did it with exuberance. She shared her hope in the salvation that she knew in Jesus. Barbra passed into eternity in September of 2020 at the age of 71, but her miracle story lives on. And for my skeptics, just want to remind you, this story has had wide exposure for many years and has faced a great deal of scrutiny. So if you'd like to take a deep dive and examine it a little bit more, I invite you to, because I already know what I think about this story. I'll let you think about that. And I hope you did like thinking about this story, because that's what this channel is all about. So be sure to like and subscribe, because there's more coming with uploads once a week here at Check Your Head Stories. See you next time.